Hey, so I'm interviewing right now for what will be my first full-time job. No more internships for me. And I'm looking at a lot of different jobs in different places. So, for example, two companies which I'm speaking to right now are ID, which is in Austin, Texas, and Naughty Dog, which is in LA, California. So, completely different places. And it's kind of made me think and just ponder on what it would mean to live in each of these places, because I think to no small degree the place that you live influences how you see the world. Um, in a really trivial example, my friend Chase, he just did an interview, or rather, he just did an internship in upstate New York. And he really didn't enjoy that location too much because he didn't have a lot of friends in the area. There wasn't a lot going on. And he often found himself on the weekends just traveling down in New York City where he had a bunch of friends. So that's one thing, right? Just the proximity to friends and family and events and stuff like that. But I think it's something deeper. I think the place that you live really affects how you see the world, in more than just, who are you spending time with. So I think a big part of that idea or that ideology came from this essay I read many years ago by a guy named Paul Graham. And now that I'm thinking about these thoughts again, what I wanted to do was revisit that essay, share it with you. I'm going to read it for you, or you can view it in the link in the description. And then, if you stick around to the end, or via the time code in the description, we could jump to sort of my thoughts on the article and whether or not it's affected kind of where I'm going right now. So I'm going to share it, but feel free to either follow along to me, just listen to me, or you can read it at the link in the description. Okay, so this is a 2008 essay called Cities and Ambition. Great cities attract ambitious people. You can sense it when you walk around one. In 100 subtle ways, the city sends you a message. You could do more. You should try harder. The surprising thing is how different these messages could be. New York tells you, above all, you should make more money. There are other messages too, of course. You should be hipper. You should be better looking. But the clearest message is that you should be richer. What I like about Boston, or rather Cambridge, is that the message there is you should be smarter. You really should get around to reading all those books you've been meaning to. When you ask what message a city sends, you sometimes get surprising answers. As much as they respect brains in Silicon Valley, the message the Valley sends is you should be more powerful. And it's not quite the same message that New York sends. Power matters in New York too, of course, but New York is pretty impressed by $1 billion, even if you merely inherited it. In Silicon Valley, no one would care except a few real estate agents. What matters in Silicon Valley is how much effect you have on the world. The reason people there care about Larry and Sergey is not their wealth, but the fact that they control Google, which affects practically everyone. How much does it matter what message a city sends? Empirically, the answer seems to be a lot. You might think that if you had enough strength of mind to do great things, you'd be able to transcend your environment. Where you live should make at most a couple % difference. But if you look at the historical evidence, it seems to matter much more than that. Most people who did great things were clumped together in a few small places where that sort of thing was done at the time. You can see how powerful cities are from something I wrote about earlier, the case of Milanese Leonardo. Practically every 15th century Italian painter you've heard of was from Florence, even though Milan was just as big. People in Florence weren't genetically different. So you have to assume that there was someone born in Milan with just as much ability as Leonardo. But what happened to him? If even someone with the same natural ability as Leonardo couldn't beat the force of environment, do you suppose that you can? I don't. I'm fairly stubborn, but I wouldn't try to fight this force. I'd rather use it. So I've thought a lot about where to live. I'd always imagined Berkeley would be the ideal place, that it would basically be Cambridge with good weather. But when I finally tried living there a couple years ago, it turned out not to be. The message Berkeley sends is you should live better. Life in Berkeley is very civilized. It's probably the place in America where someone from Northern Europe would feel most at home. But it's not humming with ambition. In retrospect, it shouldn't have been surprising that a place so pleasant would attract people interested above all in quality of life. Cambridge, with good weather, as it turns out, is not Cambridge. The people you find in Cambridge are not there by accident. You have to make sacrifices to live there. It's expensive, somewhat grubby, and the weather's often bad. So the kind of people you find in Cambridge are the kind of people who want to live where the smartest people are, even if that means living in an expensive, grubby place with bad weather. As of writing this, Cambridge seems to be the intellectual capital of the world. I realize that seems a preposterous claim. What makes it true is that it's even more preposterous to claim about anywhere else. American universities currently seem to be the best, judging from the flow of ambitious students. And what U.S. city has a stronger claim? New York? A fair number of smart people, but diluted by a much larger number of Neanderthals in suits. The Bay Area has a lot of smart people too, but again, diluted. There are two great universities, but they're far apart. Harvard and MIT are practically adjacent by West Coast standards, and they're surrounded by about 20 other colleges and universities. Cambridge, as a result, feels like a town whose main industry is ideas, where New York is finance and Silicon Valley's is startups. When you talk about cities in the sense we are, what you're really referring to is about collections of people. For a long time, cities were the only large collections of people, so you could use the two ideas interchangeably. But we can see how much things are changing from the examples I've mentioned. New York is a classic great city, but Cambridge is just part of a city, and Silicon Valley is not even that. San Jose is not, as it sometimes claims, the capital of Silicon Valley. It's just about 178 square miles at one end of it. Maybe the internet will change things further. Maybe one day the most important community you belong to will be a virtual one, and it won't matter where you live physically. But I wouldn't bet on it. The physical world is very high bandwidth, and some of the ways cities send you messages are quite subtle. One of the exhilarating things about coming back to Cambridge every spring is walking through the streets at dusk. When you can see into the houses, when you walk through Palo Alto in the evening, you see nothing but the blue glow of TVs. In Cambridge, you see shelves full of promising-looking books. Palo Alto was probably much like Cambridge in 1960, but you never guess now that there's a university nearby. Now it's just one of those richer neighborhoods in Silicon Valley. A city speaks to you mostly by accident in things you see through windows and conversations you overhear. It's something you have to seek out, but something that you can't turn off. One of the occupational hazards of living in Cambridge is overhearing the conversations of people who use interrogative intonation and declarative sentences. But on average, I'll take Cambridge conversations over New York or Silicon Valley ones. A friend who moved to Silicon Valley in the late 90s said the worst thing about living there was the low quality of eavesdropping. At the time, I thought she was being deliberately eccentric. Sure, it could be interesting to eavesdrop on people, but is good quality eavesdropping so important that it would affect where you choose to live? Now, I think I understand what she meant. The conversations you overhear tell you what sort of people you're among. No matter how determined you are, it's hard not to be influenced by the people around you. It's not so much that you do whatever a city expects of you, but that you get discouraged when no one around you cares about the same things you do. There's an imbalance between encouragement and discouragement, like that between gaining and losing money. Most people overvalue negative amounts of money. They'll work harder to avoid losing $1 than to gain one. Similarly, although there are plenty of people strong enough to resist doing something just because that's what one is supposed to do where they happen to be, bloody hell, that's a long sentence. Similarly, although there are people strong enough to resist doing something just because that's what someone's supposed to do when they happen to be, where they happen to be, there are few strong enough to keep working on something no one around them seems to care about. because ambitions are to some extent incompatible and admiration is a zero-sum game. Each city tends to focus on one type of ambition. The reason Cambridge is the intellectual capital is not just that there's a concentration of smart people there, but that there's nothing else there people care about more. Professors in New York and the Bay Area are second-class citizens till they start a hedge fund or startups, respectively. This suggests an answer to a question people in New York have wondered about since the bubble: whether New York could grow into a startup hub to rival Silicon Valley. One reason that's unlikely is that someone starting a startup in New York would feel like a second-class citizen. There's already something else people in New York admire more. In the long term, that could be a bad thing for New York. The power of an important new technology does eventually convert to money. So by caring more about money and less about power than Silicon Valley, New York is in the same way recognizing the same thing, but slower. And in fact, it has been losing to Silicon Valley at its own game. The ratio of New York to Californian residents in the Forbes 400 has decreased over time. Not all cities send a message, okay? And only those that are centers for some type of ambition do. And it can be hard to tell exactly what message a city sends without living there. I understand the messages of New York, Cambridge, and Silicon Valley because I've lived there, years in each of them. DC and LA seem to send messages as well, but I haven't spent as long in either of them to tell for sure what those messages are. The big thing in LA seems to be fame. There's an A-list of people who are the most in demand right now, and what's most admired is to be on it, or friends of those who are. Beneath that, the message is much like New York's, though perhaps with more emphasis on physical attractiveness. In DC, the message seems to be that the most important thing is who you know. You want to be an insider, and in practice this seems to work much as in LA. There's an A-list, you want to be on it, or close to someone who is. And the only difference between an A-list is how it's selected. And even that is not much different. At the moment, San Francisco's message seems to be the same as Berkeley's. You should live better. But this will change if enough startups choose SF over the Valley. During the bubble, there was a predictor of failure, a self-indulgent choice, like buying expensive office furniture. Even now, I'm suspicious when startups choose SF. But if enough good ones do, it stops being a self-indulgent choice, because the center of gravity of Silicon Valley will shift there. I haven't found anything like Cambridge for intellectual ambition. Oxford and Cambridge, England, feel like Ithaca or Hanover. The message is there, but it's not as strong. Paris was once a great intellectual center. If you went there in 1300, it might have seemed to send the same message Cambridge does now. But I tried living there for a bit last year, and the ambitions of the inhabitants are not intellectual ones. The message Paris sends now is, do things with style. I like that, actually. Paris is the only city I've lived in where people generally cared about art. In America, only a few rich people buy original art, and even the more sophisticated ones rarely get past judging it by the brand name of the artist. But looking through windows at dusk in Paris, you can see that people out there actually care about what paintings look like. Visually, Paris has the best eavesdropping I know. There's one more message I've heard about cities. In London, you can still barely hear the message that one should be more aristocratic. If you listen for it, you can also hear it in Paris, New York, and Boston. But this message is everywhere very faint. It would have been strong 100 years ago, but now I probably wouldn't have picked up on it at all if I hadn't been deliberately tuned in to that wavelength to see if there was any signal left. So far, the complete list of messages I've picked up from cities is wealth, style, hipness, physical attractiveness, fame, political power, economic power, intelligence, social class, and quality of life. My immediate reaction to this list is that it makes me slightly queasy. I'd always considered ambition a good thing, but I realize now that was probably because I'd always been implicitly understanding it to mean ambition in the areas I cared about. When you list everything ambitious people are ambitious about, it's not so pretty. On closer examination, I see a couple of things on the list that are surprising in the light of history. For example, physical attractiveness. wouldn't have been there maybe 100 years ago, although it might have been there 2,400 years ago. It has always mattered for women, but in the late 20th century, it seems to have started to matter for men as well. I'm not sure why. Perhaps some combination of the increasing power of women, the increasing influence of actors as models, and the fact that so many people work in offices now. You can't show off by wearing clothes too fancy to wear in a factory, so you have to show off with your body instead. Hipness is another thing you wouldn't have seen on the list 100 years ago, or wouldn't you? What it means is to know what's what. So maybe it has simply reduced the component of social class that consisted of being au fait. I don't know about that one. That could explain why hipness seems practically admired in London. It's version 2, in a sense, of the traditional English delight in obscure codes that only insiders understand. Now, economic power would have been on the list 100 years ago, but what we mean by it is changing. It used to mean the control of a vast human and material resources, but increasingly it means the ability to direct the course of technology. And some of the people in a position to do that are not even rich. Leaders of important open source projects, for example. The captains of industry of times past had laboratories full of clever people cooking up new technologies for them. The new breed are themselves those people. As this force gets more attention, another is dropping off the list. Social class. I think the two are related. Economic power, wealth, and social class are just different names for the same thing at different stages of its life. Economic power converts to wealth, and wealth converts to social class. So the focus of admiration is simply shifting upstream. Does anyone who wants to do great work have to live in a great city? No. All great cities inspire some sort of ambition, but they aren't the only places that do. For some kinds of work, all you need is a handful of talented colleagues. What cities provide is an audience and a funnel for peers. These aren't so critical in something like math or physics, where no audience matters except your peers, and judging ability is sufficiently straightforward that hiring and admissions committees can do it reliably. But in a field like math or physics, all you need is a department with the right colleagues in it. It could be anywhere. Los Alamos, New Mexico, for example. It's in fields like the arts or writing or technology that the larger environment matters. In these, the best practitioners aren't conveniently collected in the few top university departments or research labs, partly because talent is harder to judge, and partly because people pay for these things, so one doesn't need to rely on teaching or research funding to support oneself. It's in these more chaotic fields that it helps most to be in a great city. You need the encouragement of feeling that people around you care about the work you do. And since you have to find peers for yourself, you need the much larger intake mechanism of a great city. You don't have to live in a great city your whole life to benefit from it. The critical years seem to be early and middle ones of your career. Clearly, you don't have to grow up in a great city, nor does it matter if you go to a college in one. To most college students, a world of a few thousand people seems big enough. Plus, in college, you don't have to face the hardest kind of work, which are discovering new problems to solve. It's when you move on to the next and much harder step of a career that it helps to be in a place where you can find peers and encouragement. You seem to be able to leave if you want, once you found both. The Impressionists show the typical pattern. They were born all over France. Pizarro was born in the Caribbean. And they died all over France. But what defined them were the years they spent together in Paris. Wow, I think that's really impactful. Unless you're sure what you want to do and where the leading center for it is, your best bet is probably to try living in several places when you're young. You can never tell what message a city sends till you live there, or even whether it will still send the same one. Often your information will be wrong. For example, I tried living in Florence when I was 25, thinking it would be an art center, but turned out I was 450 years too late. Even when a city is still a live center of ambition, you won't know for sure whether its message will resonate with you till you hear it. When I moved to New York, I was very excited at first. It's an exciting place. So it took me quite a while to realize I just wasn't like the people there. I kept searching for the Cambridge of New York, and it turned out it was way, way uptown. an hour uptown by air. So people know at 16 what sorts of work they're going to do. Excuse me. Some people know at 16 what sort of work they're going to do. But in most ambitious kids, ambition seems to precede anything specific to be ambitious about. They know they want to do something great. They just haven't decided yet whether they're going to be a rock star or a brain surgeon. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it means if you have this most common type of ambition, you'll probably have to figure out where to live by trial and error. You'll probably have to find the city where you feel at home to know what sort of ambition it is that you have. All right, so that's the essay. There are a bunch of additional notes and, it's like a little mini essay in addition to that underneath. So if you want, you could check it out in the link in the description. Paul Graham, he was kind of prolific. I don't think he does as much essays now. But the ones that he has done, I've really enjoyed. I think he's a fantastic writer. And I found myself, I'm really happy I went back to this piece because when I was reading it, there was a whole bunch of things that stood out to me. And certainly some things I disagree with, like the comment about Neanderthals. I don't have the same view. And it's interesting, right? Because I noted some of the things he said, and I think it was reflective of the date of 2008. Because I think some of the things he mentioned, I'd have to go back to the text, but I think some of the things he mentioned, I would say when I hear them, I think, oh yeah, that was probably true a while ago, but I think it's less true now. One thing that stands out to me is when he was talking about people finding a community online. I think the further we progress into the future, the more that seems not a likelihood, but like inevitability. I find that so many people use social media as a way to like retain and engage with their relationships. You know, like how close are you to the same 100 people you pass on your commute to work every day? How close are you to those 100 people versus the 100 people who are constantly in your feed, even if they might live miles and miles away? So that's something I was thinking about. And then the other thing I was thinking about while I was reading this was he talked about how Silicon Valley, there's really what is Silicon Valley value? And he said that Silicon Valley has a great value on power. And I don't think that's true. I think the ambition of Silicon Valley is to have a tremendous honor. So, for example, in Silicon Valley, there's like a lot of founders, but it's considered, I think, much more like it's much more admired when you've done like a startup and it fails than if you're like living in a powerful job doing the day-to-day grind, right? And Graham, right, his successor, Sam Altman, is this like entrepreneur who made a startup and failed, right? I don't know 100% on that, but I think if anything that reflects like I just don't think that's true. I don't think it's about power. I think it's about honor, you know, and what you've achieved. Because I think in Silicon Valley there's more respect for the sage, you know, the Yoda character, the person who's like been through it and can help teach the next person. I think that person has a lot more value, even if they're not super powerful, even if they're living in a little swamp in some shit, you know, swamp in Dagobah. I think there's a lot of respect given to like the mentor here. Right, but that's my take, right? And it does, and I don't know if this was really acknowledged in the article, right? Because it mentions how the city has a message, but I think different people can be in the same city, and I think they could hear different messages. And I think that's an important note. If we both go to the same place, we might get different things out of it. And so, of course, it loops back around to my own experience, which is now I have to think about where to live. And let's say I receive an offer to live in Austin, Texas. What does that city say? It's not one he addressed here. I don't think he talked about Texas at all, right? But it's like, you know, how would that city affect me? How would the people around me affect me? I always love this quote, which is about your friends. And it goes something along the lines of, your friends are a reflection of who you are. And if you want to know the kind of person you are, just look at your friends. And I think that's very true. I think we surround ourselves with people whose values and I guess just values. I want to say morality, but it's kind of the same thing. Whose values, whose ambitions reflect that of our own. And so I do think in many ways, if you have a friend who's a close friend, I think it's likely because some aspects of their personality are reflections of aspects of your personality. And I think if you were to take all your friends, your closest friends, and squish them up into a human-sized person, you might get yourself. That's just kind of a crazy idea. But maybe if you take the right amount of each person. And those are the friends, right? Those are the friends you choose. And so I guess if I'm moving to a new city, I have to make new friends, I have to go to these game dev meetups and stuff. And I think it's also a really important point of like this idea of, he didn't, I think, explicitly name it competition, but I think it is competition. I think it's this idea that like, wow, I'm around all these amazing painters, and not only will I learn from them, but they're going to push me forward because I want to be as good as them, and they want to be as good as me. We're both going to probably perceive a little bit of like this bias of like, oh wow, these other guys are really doing a great job. I need to catch up to them. And I think it's that sentiment that propels a community, a working group forward. I think that has a tremendous value. I think it's the same reason why when you're running like a marathon or something, I think it's useful to have people who are like pace setters, right? They're fresh, but they run at the speed that you need to be running. Of course, they leave and get replaced, but you have to keep running that speed. But the fact that you're with someone who's now fresh and they can maintain that speed and they can do it strong, I think it pushes you to run faster. This isn't a physical pursuit, right? It's the focus here is definitely on an intellectual one. But I know that I'm really inspired by the people in my life who make great games, right? He was talking about artists. That's certainly my case, right? Like I'm making games. I'll have a full-time job, right? But I'll be making indie games in my free time. And I think the value of having other indie developers in my life, people who I consider better than myself, who've achieved success far greater than mine, and are in some ways propelling me to aspire to achieve the same, I don't think that you can underestimate the impact that has on an individual. Certainly on myself, because I think I see those people and I aspire to be like them. For example, I've met some people at Stanford who are making apps or music, or their own startup, and it really inspires me. So I think in conclusion, I'm really excited to learn more about these cities that I'm looking into. I want to see what the kind of people are who live there, and in some ways try to infer what influence they'll have on me. I'm interested in if you've experienced this phenomenon in your own life. If perhaps you've lived in a city or you went to college somewhere different than the place you grew up and found that the ethos, like the environment there in some way impacted you in an intellectual way, in a way that like changed your value system, changed your ambition maybe. This idea of being a second-class citizen, I mean, I think it's right. I think it's really toxic, right? It's like if you grow up, it's like what happened to Rodney Mullen when he was the best freestyle skater in the world, and then, in his words, freestyle died. He was the world champion of a sport that nobody cared about. And so because of that, I think the sport didn't receive as much innovation as it could have. Everybody moved to street skate. And now it's like, I think there's less people in skateboarding than there has been. So if you're making games, and maybe games aren't as popular, which, is not true now, but certain kinds of games I think are less popular with current changes in the industry, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I think with certain games being less popular, it's almost like, wow, if you don't want to get caught under the swell, you need to find rock. You need to find an environment, a community of people who value those games. So those are just my thoughts. I'd love to hear what yours are. Chat me in the comments or send me a DM. And thanks for listening.